Welcome to the session Moving from Agile to Agility. It's a pleasure to welcome Peter Lamb. Peter traveled from Australia here to be with us. In Australia, he helps large corporations and governmental departments to benefit from agility. And I have to look at my notes. I've posted, it's very agile. So Peter has strong expertise in scaling agile for large to extremely large programs, so 150 people to 18,000 people. And if you're interested in agility, and in Australia, it's basically impossible not to meet Peter. And he was also recognized for his commitment and track record by being the appointed Oceania representative for Agile 20 Reflect, celebrating the 20th birthday of the Agile Manifesto. Currently, Peter works as a principal at Claritas Consulting and is leading the, now it comes, Center of Expertise Lead for Ways and Working and Delivery for an Australian corporation. Peter, we are very excited to learn more about agility. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much. As Michael said, my name is Peter Lamb and I'm from Down Under, so I'm really excited to be here. I'm going to share some general insights about making this shift from Agile to Agility, and this is based on a range of organisations I've worked with, both government departments, private enterprises and things like that. And there's some common patterns, common lessons that I've learnt when we go down this path of agility. Now, I do talk quite quickly. I recognise that lots of the people in the room have PhDs and can talk faster than I can, but for everyone else, if I talk too fast, just let me know, okay? If you've got a burning question, jump in. Otherwise, we can take questions towards the end. I'll also note that I am between everyone here and lunch, so, I'll try and keep it as energetic as I possibly can. So what I'll do is I'm going to talk about organisations, I'll talk about Agile, then I'll talk about agility, and then I'll talk about the 5 lessons I've learned that I've learned from helping organisations move from Agile to agility. Okay? Now, before I go on, can everyone hear me? Yep. Cool. Thumbs up. I'm sorry, I'm quite short. I can't see everyone, but hopefully you can see the slides. All right. So let's get rolling. So most organisations have quite a standard organisational structure, same since about the 1900s, right? Does everyone sort of look familiar to this? You have some exec at the top, layers of management, lots of people doing work from lots of divisions, right? Yes, that all makes sense. Just want to make sure we level set, appreciate that Europe does operate differently to Australia. We're a bit different. We're upside down, but that's okay. I just want to make sure that we all get that, right? Cool. And in this environment, we deliver IT projects and IT initiatives, and somebody or collection of people wrote this, the Agile Manifesto. Are we all familiar with this? This is kind of important to me, because if you don't, then we might have to take a different path in this conversation. Does everyone know this? Yes, excellent. Let's move on then. Right, so in lots of organisations, people have said this in 2001, and what it is a pattern of common things about successful delivery of software projects, right? And as a result, most of us who work in this environment go, hey, we have this thing called waterfall, predictive delivery. We've got this Agile thing. It seems to work in Agile projects. The challenge I put out to project managers is if you're working in software and you're not using Agile, there is something wrong, okay? It's a better way of working. Statistically, you're more likely to succeed. So this should be fairly normal in most organisations. That should not be the challenge. Yes, there are challenges with dependencies and scaling across to 1,000, 1,500 or more people in a single program of work. We're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about scaling it beyond that, right? Because when you look at the number of people that have Scrum Master certifications, we look at the number of people that have SAFe certifications, right? We know it works, we know people can train it, but the problem that we have is why have so few organizations managed to scale beyond Agile delivery into Agile organizations? That's what we're going to talk about today, okay? So I'm not going to talk about maths, not going to talk about physics, not going to talk about black holes, AI, crypto, neural networks. They're all cool topics, but that's not it. We're going to talk about organizations and primarily around people. So the first thing we'll do is, let's talk about what business agility is, okay? So business agility is the capacity and willingness of an organization to adapt to, create and leverage change for their customers' benefit. This comes from a group called the Business Agility Institute. Has anyone heard of the Business Agility Institute? Okay. The Business Agility Institute is an industry body who is not-for-profit. They're not a not-for-profit. They're industry body, so their purpose is not to make money. Their purpose is to research about organisations that adopt Agile and agility across the organisation. Okay? They have one product, which is corporate membership, that does surveys, and then they have run a set of conferences and things. They don't sell consultancy services. They don't sell any of that. And as a result, they're a really good source for anyone who wants to learn about Agile or agility in the main. But from their standpoint is, what does that actually mean? In their words, it means this. So there's three main areas: leadership, individuals and organisations. Under each, there are three domains, for instance, around people management, enterprise agility and others. And of course, underneath that, there's a set of behaviours that they measure. Okay? So that's what we mean by business agility. It sits outside of technology. Right? Technology is typically not the problem that you have. Right? You can make a pricing change, in your IT system. It take you a couple of minutes. But the question is, how do you get it out to the rest of the organisation, through your call centres, through your marketing people, through your retail people, and things like that? And that's where business agility starts to become more important. Okay? Are we all comfortable with what we're talking about so far? Good. All right. So let's roll on then. Okay. This is where it starts to get more interesting. So let's have a look at how this might show up in an organisation, all right? So this was published in 2012, Spotify model of how they organise their people to do delivery. Are we familiar with this? Yes, most of us, kind of, some of us know. There's a few who don't know, so I'll step through it quickly. So you have a collection of people that are called tribes, somewhere between 100 and 150 people. Chapters, which is where your people leadership, coaching and things like that come from. They all sit in squads with a PO, typically a Scrum Master or some sort of person to help facilitate stuff. And they have guilds that connect people of common skills together. And the tribes fundamentally focus on delivering value, right? Now, if you haven't seen it, Spotify engineering blog is my recommendation. There are 2 videos, watch both, not just one, watch both, where they're doing and explains how their model works. What makes this unusual is that it actually talks about the human structure and how your humans are organised in your business, not just how your work is organised, okay? Does that make sense? We're cool with that? I've seen some nods, so I'm going to roll on, right? So the question is, why do I always talk about the Spotify model as an example of how they organise people to deliver? Because this starts to frame the challenge that we have. The reason we do that is, from the 15th State of the Agile report, the Spotify model, 5% of the population that uses the Spotify model to scale Agile. The problem that you have is Spotify goes, don't copy our model, copy our cultures, our values, and all the other good things. Don't copy the people, the process, and the boxes we have, right? SAFe, of course, is the number one, and then there's a number of others that sit behind it that are predominantly Scrum-based. Now, what makes this unusual, and the reason why I use the Spotify model as the baseline, is that lots of organisations who are starting to adopt the Spotify model use it as an organisational design construct, right? So they change the people reporting lines, reduce layers of managers, and simplify their organisation to make it work. So some examples of this, 2 of the big companies in certainly Australia, and some of them, which I think are European-based, allegedly use a Spotify model and have used it as an excuse to reduce headcount, right? Not within IT, but across all of their business. So they have tribes that sit in the business. There's ones that look at mortgages, ones that look at investment banking and things like that. So are we all fairly comfortable that this is quite a common sort of approach? The question is why, and the answer is really simple. Because fundamentally, the bulk of the consulting firms that I've dealt with, the strategy ones and the big 4, all recommend it. Because it does 2 things. One is it dramatically reduces headcount, and 2, it allows them to spend lots of money teaching people that you could stuff on the Spotify structure that they learnt from a 13-minute video, right? That's quite compelling. Just to help share, and this is all about framing the argument, right? So just to share one of the stories, I went to an Agile conference with a client, and they said, oh, this bank, ANZ, they've got the same slides and the same pictures and the same models as us. And I said, yes. Okay. And the next question was, so are they using the same consultants as us? No. Are they copying us? No, they moved before us. Then how do they get the same picture? I said, well, because it's all based on this thing called Spotify, and there's a video, right? And the problem is that the video isn't widely watched outside of the technology space, and as a result, you know, our friends that are consultants happen to sell consulting transformations to them that, you know, that are most aligned to them making money, right? And as a result, we're seeing an increasing number of organisations adopt the Spotify model as a way of re-engineering their organisation. And that's how they're using the way to talk about, they're using that as a way of talking about organisational agility, okay? So, having gone through and worked with a number of these organisations in this space, there are 5 things that I've learned about this that I'm going to share. Some might be interesting, some might be boring. Let's see. Not a lot of it has to do with physics or maths. So let's see how this goes, right? So the first lesson, right? What happens is when you go through an organisational change, right, your current organisation and current manager has a role that says, I control budget, I control people, right? That's how it works. In the Spotify model, it shifts to a point where you control budget or you control people, you don't control both. So there's a separation, right? So when you look at managers and the people that deal with them, a lot of them have, you know, been around, working for some years, a bit of an exec, a bit of a leader, a bit of a status, a bit of an ego associated to it. The model and the role of their job has materially shifted, right? And when you're doing and adopting Agile at scale, this is actually one of the key challenges. Now, I'm going to be risky with the full room, but let's ask, with the shift in the role of management, what type of issues does that create? Either I've lost everyone, or no one knew that was a question, right? Was that a really bad question, or was it? Still reading. Far away.
What I've seen in my organization is that managers and workers split in their mindset, split in the way of working, so the company is losing.
Yep. So the comment that was made is that the way of working for managers and people are different, so they're split and they go divergent, and therefore they don't really connect. Yep. That's certainly one of the challenges. One of the other challenges we find, and I touched upon this earlier, is that the role of the manager who says, I have 100 people working for me, now no longer has 100 people working for them. They have a budget and a set of accountabilities, and typically someone else has the people reporting. So they are no longer God to their workers, right? So therefore, the role of a manager has changed. And one of the most common, so this comes from a guy called Frederick Taylor, which talked about Taylorism and the regional management. So most of the organisational structures we see are very much based like this, right? So basically the managers knew what men, so this was written in the 1900s, are seeking to do, and they basically tell the people what to do. David Marquette from Turn the Ship Around is sort of, you know, who was a submarine commander, talks very much around leadership is about communicating, inspiring people. And that's the shift in terms of leaders and managers. And the role of managers have changed, right? So practically, what that looks like is that I quite frequently use something from Jürgen Apello and Management 3.0. Is anyone familiar with this author? Only a couple, okay? All right. He's European based, so I actually thought the entire crowd would know him. So he talks about that there's 3 different steps of management. Management basically at the start says, leaders assume the improvement of the whole requires monitoring, repairing, and replacing of parts. So the organisation is a machine. 2.0, people are valuable assets and managers are becoming servant leaders. Management 3.0 says, we think about the organisation as a community where people choose to commit to and choose to contribute to, right? And as those organisations shifts, the role of managers has to shift, right? So a manager that has worked for 20 or 30 years has to change the way in which they move and lead, right? And of course, Management 3.0 has something called Marty the Management Monster that talks about what they do. And he's very big on managers manage the system, but not people, right? So the role of managers have changed from managing people to managing the system of work, right? So that's the first major shift that we typically see when we go from Agile to Agility. Does that sort of make sense? Far away.
Could you also mention Management 4.0 and what's the relation with Agile leadership?
Can I mention the Management 4.0 is and the relationship with Agile leadership? No. I'm not familiar with, I've seen people talk about what 4.0 looks like. So there's a lot of technology in the industry 4.0, but from a management structure, we sort of see more increasing number of modern companies adopt this, where the organisation and the community they choose to be part of, whereas we see a lot of corporate organisations saying they talk about servant leadership, right? So I haven't seen anything that sort of, from an organisation management standpoint, move beyond this. Does that make sense? Maybe. Okay. Let's talk over lunch. Keen to hear more. All right, cool. So the first one is that when you're a manager and you're going from Agile to Agility, the first step is that managers have to make the leap from managing people to managing the system of work. And therein lies the first big challenge as we start to try and scale Agile from delivery to beyond IT, right? So the second thing, right? The skills that are required to do our job continues to expand and accelerate. So if I take a sort of project and tech lens to it, the first thing that we have is this, the SDLC that was published in, does anyone know when it was published? Brain says 1950s. I've got a mental blank from 1970s, sorry. 1970s, and the military then built it out. So then as a result, software engineering, you basically sit in one box. This is a model on DevOps. Does anyone know when this came out? 2010-ish, right? Around that sort of ballpark, right? And then, of course, then we've got the DevSecOps, which has come out more recently in late 2010. And these are all from Royce, who talks about the SDLC, and then the other two are from Atlassian, right? So the role of a developer or engineer, for instance, has dramatically shifted over the last 20 or 30 years, right? That's not a huge problem per se. The problem that you sort of have is actually the speed at which the changes occurred, right? So when we talk about, speed, we talk about, there's lots of different, you can talk about programming languages and things like that. The easiest way in my mind to reflect that is that the speed of technology changes continue to increase, but we're limited by a speed of learning. What that means is if you look at the technology adoption curves of somewhere like a power steering through to a tablet, the speed at which adoption occurs has dramatically shrunk. And if you think of the technology that's required to power each of these, it's clear that it's dramatically accelerating, right? The problem that you have is whilst technology and learning of technology continues to accelerate, the problem that you have is the way that we learn hasn't materially changed, right? So when we talk about learning, we normally talk about things like novice and beginner, where we learn basics things, and then after a couple of 100 hours of practice, we become vaguely competent in it. And then, of course, over years, we become proficient. And then if you look at someone Gladwell, some of the research he's done, he would argue it takes 10,000 hours of deliberate practice to become an expert. So that's about 5 years of deliberate practice, okay? So the challenge that we have, the second challenge that we have is that whilst the speed of technology changes continue to increase, as you can see through here, the way that we learn hasn't materially changed, right? So therefore, the speed of our learning, the rate of Agile and Agility can be adopted outside of technology is limited by the speed of learning. Okay? That's the second observation, right? Does that sort of make sense? Yeah. Cool. Everyone's quite stilted. I'm not sure if it's because I'm not speaking clearly. Yep, now I've got a few thumbs up. Okay, cool. All right, lesson 3. So the third observation I sort of make is that organisational processes are optimised for management control. Does that sort of make sense? Yeah. Fairly simple, very easy. Anyone want to think of some examples of that? Company? Any other examples?
Basically, every organization.
Yep. Football club, yep. So everything is optimised for management control. So things like, this is one of my favourites, is things like the annual budgeting process, right? So has anyone been involved in the end of financial year or the new financial year budgeting process and how painful that is? Yeah. So that was introduced by McKinsey's, believe it or not, in 1922, right? And they did it as a way of controlling expenditure as a control mechanism many years ago, right? Now, if we look at it from other favourite processes for me, is things like the annual performance review. Who has an annual performance review? Not anymore? We need to talk. I want to hear more. For some reason, lots of organisations that we work with like to continue to do the annual performance review and the annual bell curving process. Are you all familiar with the bell curving process? So they take a population of people, say engineers, 100 of them, they rank them from 1 to 5, they put them into the population curve. People that are in the middle get a bonus. The people that are 4s and 5s get bigger bonuses, and those underneath get performance managed. And they force everything into standard distribution curve, right? Okay? I'm seeing some allergic reactions. This happens a great deal in lots of large corporate organisations. So the challenge that you have here is that organisations are managed, are optimised, and the processes you have are optimised for control. So budgets and annual performance reviews, how they manage money and how they manage people. But at no point in time do they have anything that talks about customer, which I find really interesting, right? The problem is when you start to optimise and you want to shift the organisation from talking about agile delivery to agile organisations or agility, you now have to start to optimise for customer, right? And the problem is that our process that we have are not designed for that. So let me give you some examples. Now, there is if we look at the annual performance review, so Gallup's a research organisation that focuses on employee and employee health. According to them, 14% of employees strongly agree the performance reviews, the annual performance reviews, inspire them to improve, right? Which kind of means that, I'm no physicist, but something like 86% don't think that that's the case, right? And about 1/3 of the time, they find that the performance review is too bad, that the performance declines. Right? So this is an example where you have an organisational process designed for control, but people are trying to optimise for customer value, right? And they're in conflict, right? That's the first issue. The second issue you then have is that they're calling it the management bureaucracy. The management bureaucracy over a number of years seems to continue to increase over the last number of years. So that in a manager's role, up to 35% of the time is spent on bureaucracy and internal meetings. Right. Is that familiar to anyone in this room? Yeah? So we're optimising for management control. We spend more time talking about the work than actually doing the work. We spend more time reporting on the work than doing for the work. And I don't know how anyone else has been measured. Increasingly, we all get measured on our deliverable as being turned into the number of Zoom meetings, the number of events, the number of things we attend, and how big our spreadsheets are modelling the different opportunities and outcomes that we can have, right? So we're not doing anything, again, about customer value. We're doing increasing amounts of management bureaucracy work, right? So if you think about the number of people in your organisation, you have people that do the work and you have this sort of vague pyramid, which is the corporate structure. You have a large proportion of that corporate structure whose sole job is to do bureaucracy work, right? Now, when we're trying to drive Agile across the organisation from, delivery across the rest of the organisation, like finance, like marketing and others, we have this entire layer of people whose sole job is on management bureaucracy that we need to change and tackle. And therein starts to lie the heart of the problem when we're trying to scale Agile into agility, okay? The brutal reality is, however, is that the people that grew up in this system of work actually don't know any different, right? So if we talk to a lot of the managers who've been around for 20 or 30 years, a lot of them don't deliberately go, no, I need to do more budget control, or I need you to do more meetings and think. That's not what the intent is. They hate meetings, they hate the treadmill. But the problem is they generally don't know any different about what they need to do. And when we start to propose to talk about Agile, we talk about transparency, we talk about inspect and adapt, it's a completely different paradigm to what they're used to, right? And this is the problem you have, again, if you look at this pyramid, is that middle layer, that anyone that's got manager or above in that layer, this is the world that they grew up in and the world that they've been very successful in, and we're asking them to change how it works, right? This is not a problem that's solved by maths, it's not a problem that's solved by physics, it's a problem solved by talking to people, right? So Gary Hamel has an interesting quote which I'll put up there, right? And I'll give you a moment to read it. But it says that right now your country has 21st century internet-enabled business processes, mid-20th century management processes built upon 19th century management principles, right? And that is actually the nature of the organisations that we're working in today, right? And I touched upon Frederick Taylor earlier on and Taylorism and scientific management. It was designed around people who are working through observation in steel mills and things like that, doing physical labour, not those working in creative, arts, or I call creative arts being things like development work, where you're trying to creatively solve a problem. It's quite a different style of management that you need, right? And that's actually one of the key issues around, certainly when you're trying to transition from Agile to Agility. Whilst the managers may want to do it, they don't know how to do it, right? Cool. Any questions or comments so far? Good. It's not a language, not a cultural barrier. Good. Okay. Everyone's with me. Right. Number 4. Organisations sit within larger systems that dictate behaviour. Right. So if you remember this organisation I showed earlier from our Agile that we took on, which is your standard organisational structure. The person on the top, he or she, typically a CEO of some sort, a managing director, reports to a board. Looks familiar to, this is an Australian construct. I'm sure it's pretty familiar to European construct as well, right? The board, of course, makes a bunch of money, right? Because that's the nature of how companies typically, some have societal things, some have changes, but most companies are driven for some sort of return on investment or return on capital, right? That capital is then given to a set of investors, right? And those investors are typically people like you and me, right? And this is the larger corporate system that we typically work. So the example that I used, I think yesterday was, we call them super funds in Australia, but I think we call them pension funds. Is that correct in Europe? Yep. Yeah. So you have pension funds that invest heavily in companies to drive a predictable return, right? Why? Because you invest in 20 years' time or 30 years of time for those of us, or less for some of us if we're lucky. We retire, we want to have pension, and we want to be able to retire in comfort, right? Does that all make sense? The problem is the expectations that the pension fund who is representing us is driving predictable returns. That expectation is placed on the board, which then is then pushed onto the CEO to have quarterly, predictable returns every 3, 6, 9, and 12 months. Okay, does that make sense? Yeah. So then what does that drive inside the organisation?
Manage and control.
Sorry?
Manage and control.
Management and control, right? Predictability or the illusion of control through predictability, okay? So when the manager or the project manager or the program manager or someone with a manager in their title doing the bureaucratic work says to you, when are you going to deliver this? Is it going to be in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 6 months? There's a reason for that, because that's what that person's been asked to do. The second question, when you build this, what is the benefit of what you're going to build? Why is it important? Because they have to aggregate hundreds of things together to drive the benefit structure to this person that drives it back to the board, which drives dividends, right? So when there's an argument that says, oh, well, we can't plan what we need because we don't know, we need to experiment, that's fine. But at an aggregate layer, somebody has to, at some point in time, push back up to the board and beyond to say, these are the benefits you're going to get every 3, 6, 9, and 12 months, and this is how you're going to drop, and these are the drops you're going to have, right? So while we can push for change, the problem is we're part of this change, right? So where you get some companies that I work with in Australia is they're a technology company. What they do is they are known as a dividend share, which means that their shareholders expect them to give out money every 12 months based on the profits they make, right? And they're like a really predictable dividend return. The problem that you have is that when they're trying to compete against Amazon, Amazon has never set that as an expectation. So therefore, Amazon doesn't give out dividends. They just, reinvest all their money back into their growth. This puts a handbrake, the share market puts a handbrake on those types of companies, because if the CEO was to change the structure from being a dividend share into a growth share, the share price would drop. And he or she would probably lose their job, because that's not the expectation of the systems, right? So what can we do to change that, right? As an example, and this is one I think we touched upon yesterday through some of the conversations, is that things like ethical investments, ESG investments, are they concepts that I think that a lot of them come from here, actually come from Europe more than anywhere else, to be honest, where you can choose the super funds you use or choose the pension funds or the investment funds you use so they only support companies that have very good ESG records or very good environmental records, right? And then that can start to shift things. There's an argument that says that as we start to change what we want, our pension funds will change and that will then change the companies. But when we're actually in an organisation trying to say to the CFO going, we don't need to budget because it doesn't make sense, it's not agile to budget, it's not agile to plan, whilst that may or may not be true, it doesn't work for the system that you're in, right? And they won't ever change their position until the broader system shifts, because that's not how they're rewarded, right? Of course, this is all underpinned by government values. So I think this is the local government house, is it? I got it right? Yes, Google works, yes. Sorry. So I went there with Michael yesterday and I thought, that doesn't look like the picture I've got in my presentation, so I hope I got it right. And of course, the other thing that's also underpinned is by the core values and the society of values, right? And what we're seeing is we're starting to see more tension of this playing out, where CEOs are making statements, and coronavirus has been a great example, where some of the leaders in Australia have gone, no, everyone in our company, if you face public, you must get vaccinated. And they're making decisions that potentially cross the line in terms of what we've previously said from corporate leaders because of the value base, and they're trying to shift the needle on how the organisation works, right? But the message here is that all organisations sit in larger systems, right? And as a result, there will always be a limit on how far towards this agility angle you can go, right? So some organisations will definitely go further than others, and so tech companies, AWS and others can go further because they've got different expectation shareholders, some of the traditional listed companies. Okay, so the fifth lesson, right? This surprises no one. Change is really, really hard, right? But let me put this into context. So you remember this organisation, you remember this person at the top. So if you look at your organisation of the S&P 500, because these numbers are really easy to pull from, does anyone in the room know what is the median salary of someone, a CEO in the S&P 500? The median, not the average. The average can obviously be very, very high. We're talking about the median, so the one in the middle. US dollars, of course, because I can't convert it to euros. It's probably the same, yeah. It's only the Australian dollar that's diving. Anyone want to put a number out there? $500,000? What does everyone think? Yes or no? Higher or lower? Higher. Higher? Cool. Anyone want to take a bid? 10 million? Sorry, what? 800,000. Higher or lower?
Higher. Do you mean base salary or with benefits?
With benefits, all up.
20 million.
20 mil? No, not quite. The median salary on S&P 500 CEO is $12.4 million US dollars. So, motivation to do work, right? I think at that point in time, money ceases to become your key driver of value, right? But what I do find interesting, right, is that someone has got 12.4 million US dollars or 12.4 million reasons to say what they're doing is right. And they've probably had somewhere between 20 and 30 years of reinforcement that what they've done is right. And they're the top of the current jungle, they're the king of the jungle or queen of the jungle that they're currently in. Right? So that's talks to motivation, right? Why should I change? Because if I bunker down for another year or two, it'll all go away, right? Issue one, right? The second point is this is one of the planes that I came over across from Australia, I think, maybe an older version. That little red box up there is what they call autopilot and habits. Why do I think that autopilot is so important? It works most of the time. That's a great example. So autopilot when you're flying a plane works most of the time. The problem is the autopilot that most of our leaders have, which influences somewhere about 45% of your daily activities are driven by habits, 90% is driven by, 90% of your entire behaviour is almost automatic or driven by some core underlying things that you do. So, you know, the habits being brushing your teeth or the habits you have in conversations and things like that, right? So if you think about it, right, I've got 30 years of experience and 12.4 million reasons every year to say that I'm doing it right. And a lot of that experience has driven a whole set of autopilots and patterns that I know that works. When we're trying to shift from Agile to agility, we're asking them to change these habits. So who successfully changed a habit? Cool. Anyone care to share? You don't have to. Anyone care to share?
Well, it's like everything in life. It's just
Practice. All right? Thanks, Michael. Sorry. All right, so this is from BJ, a guy called BJ Fogg, right? And he talks, this is a behaviour model that he uses to explain stuff. Curiously, you'll find, my understanding is he teaches at Stanford, and much of the social media people that you work with have come through his course, right? So let me explain the model. He talks about, motivation, high motivation, low motivation, and ability, can you do it or not do it, right? Basically, it's really simple, right? If you have high motivation and it's hard, you hit a trigger point and then you do it, right? If you really find it easy to do, right, you don't need a lot of motivation, and there's your what they call the activation threshold when you do stuff. The example I give you is, for instance, has anyone tried changing the way they brush their teeth? No? Okay, this is really weird, so just bear with me. This is a personal example. I've been working with my dentist, and every time she does an inspection, she goes, you need to brush further on the top right, top left, whatever corner. So, of course, dutifully, I note it in my phone, and dutifully, when I get home, I put a Post-it note on the mirror, in front of the mirror when I brush my teeth. So every time I need to do it, I go, I got to brush here. So adjust my brushing technique, right? Real easy to do, because I have an ability to brush my teeth. I've done it for a few years. Whether I have high or low motivation doesn't matter. The activation threshold is really easy, right? And that's how I change one habit. Now, if you're trying to change other habits like smoking, there are other ones. Like you've got the physical side, you've got the social side, you've got the automatic patterns you need to build into it, right? The problem that you have when you're talking about leaders that are motivated by the 12.4 million reasons, the issue that you have is that if 40% of what they're doing is driven by experience and what has worked before, this means that the habits and experience they have drives and infuses every single conversation and interaction they have at work. What we're asking for is for them to apply this across hundreds of individual reactions, email, conversations, and thought processes we need. Right? So we're trying to check them to shift from, this command and control to this either servant leadership or even further down the path of this community. So then all of a sudden you're not asking them to change one habit, you ask them to change hundreds of little habits and patterns that built out over the years to work really well. Okay? How's that sound? Compelling. Good. So when I talk about the 5 things that I've learned, right, from transforming at scale, I don't believe that these things are really talked about enough, which is why I love sharing it. And I generally don't believe the most scaling methods we talk about ever touch these, right? So your role of a manager goes from managing people to managing systems. As your speed of technology change continues to increase, we are limited and will always be limited by speed of learning. Your organisational processes are optimised for management control, not customer value, and when you switch it, it'll break. Organisations work in larger systems that dictate behaviours, and of course, habits are hard to change: motivation, ability, and trigger. Cool, thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for your insights. Are there any questions? Okay.
Thank you for the presentation. What's your opinion on SAFe?
I love how beautifully written the SAFe website is and how it's introduced lots of terminologies to the general management, general population about lean and agile and servant leadership and things like that. What frustrates me is 2 things. The first one is that sometimes they change definitions and values to what industry would understand, and the roles that they define are different to what the rest of industry would be used to. So it creates a little bit of a silo. The second challenge that I have is that, and I don't know if it's necessarily to do with SAFe and what Dean's written. I think it's more to do with how it's implemented. The nature of SAFe means that there are so many roles that you can almost change a job title of role, not materially do any shifts, and then be agile, right? So you sort of avoid the challenge of actually leaning in, building the culture of transparency, inspecting and adapting, building quality in, all those kind of good things don't tend to work for me, right? Was that politically correct enough?
When I hear SAFe, I usually run the other way. So.
Yeah, it can become very, this is what the idea where it can become management-centric rather than customer value-centric, right? And I think it's designed on the management-centric front, and it doesn't optimize enough for customer values, my personal view.
Okay, yeah, thank you also very much for the presentation.
Thank you.
I kind of thought about this, that what you mentioned now is a lot of problems that organizations face when trying to become more agile. So what will your proposition be for companies that are trying to actively become an agile company? Can they just follow standard procedures, the standards that we have about agility?
I think that's a really good question. I think the first thing that I encourage people to do is Agile is not necessarily about processes, it's not about methods, it's got nothing to do with that. It's all about people and people delivering value, right? And I think it's very easy when you talk about methods and Scrum versus Kanban versus SAFe versus Nexus and less. I actually think they're interesting arguments and academic arguments, and no one really cares in the business world, right? They care about what is the value you're going to deliver to my customer, how's that going to change? And I think if we keep the customer pretty front center of what we do, and then we start to inspect and adapt how we deliver better value towards that customer, I think we'll get to the same outcome, right? And it'll have to grow organically. I think if you start with a human or an organizational design construct, you start, which is what Spotify is, you start with the process construct, which is what SAFe is, I think you miss the two underpinning important things is the people side and what technology you have, because they're the two biggest limitations you have to adopting either two. Does that sort of make sense? Yeah, it does. Thank you. Cool.
Hi, Peter. Thank you so much for your talk. I recently came across the Spotify model for the first time. It was actually in a blog post that was posted on Hacker News 5 days ago. And its title was Spotify is not using the Spotify model.
True.
And it actually dates back to 2020, so it's not like breaking news. And in that blog post, they brought up various counter arguments to why the Spotify model is a good model. They emphasize a couple points where it fails to work or might not work as well as expected. And in fact, the authors of the Spotify model at Spotify themselves emphasized that it was never fully implemented at Spotify either. Maybe you could comment a bit on the pros and cons of that model and what you think about it, because to me it wasn't really clear in the beginning whether you recommend that model. So yeah,
cool.
Thank you so much.
That's a really good question. So I think the comment that I make about the Spotify model is that there's a video that explains how it's used and how it works, and it's free, right? Then somebody then translates to a bunch of slide decks, and then somebody then takes it to then some CEO in some sort of business lounge and said, hey, I can reduce a number of layers in your management by going agile and adopting this thing called the Spotify model, right? And typically that's how it's sold at a large organization. And what they typically do is they reduce many of the layers of the bureaucracy and management, and then the consultants walk away after doing many, many years of training. So that's typically what we observe. Do I recommend the model? I think the thing about the Spotify model that I think that isn't really as well understood as it could be is that they spent many years first decoupling all their technology, decoupling their website and all that kind of stuff into the applets that then meant each tribe could work independently of each other and decouple the dependencies, right? And this is where I say, in agility, it starts a lot with technology, right? And the architecture that you have. A lot of organizations I've seen have started with the organizational lens, put this on top, not touch the technology, and then realise that everything hits the same set of core technology teams and they can't release in parallel, right? So does the Spotify model work? Well, it works really well for Spotify for a point in time. Is it something you should copy? Well, it depends on the organisation, the culture, the behaviours that you have, the technology sets you have and things like that. Do I recommend it? Sure. If it works for you, you should do it. If it doesn't work for you, you shouldn't do it, right? If that makes sense. I don't think there is a perfect model for every organisation because every organisation is different. But the things about the Spotify model that are fantastic is the culture, is the focus on the culture on craft and technical excellence, the culture of equality, the culture of, you know, communicating, working together as a team. And the whole idea, and I think one of my favourite ones is actually the idea of a guild, which comes from the whole idea of craft, where you start as a craftsperson, become a journeyman, you become a master craftsman, etc., etc., etc. So that idea of building those skills and things like that, those ideas and ideals of expertise and things like that feel like they've been lost, certainly in the West. When I work with the US or Australia, they tend not to get picked up quite as much because they don't have the same culture of what guilds have that Europe has, right? So I think there's a lot that's lost in translation about it. Should you use it? If it works for your organisation, yes. Does it have some great ideas? Yes, I think it does. Does it answer your sort of question? Yeah. You'll find a lot of Spotify coaches say, don't copy the Spotify model, copy our culture, copy the way we invest in our people, you know, support, you know, help, you know, copy the way we work with our people, right? Cool. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Peter, for the great presentation. One of your lessons was about how the sort of societal constraints that a company is embedded in can put limits on how much agility can be implemented. I want to challenge that a little bit because I would think that like the largest constraint or outside constraint that a company is in is the free market. Either it's competitive or not, and if it's not, it will die. And this business model or this organization model will no longer exist. So if more agility really makes a company more productive and profitable, wouldn't the more agile companies always win out in the end?
So just there's two observations that I'll make, and the second one will be a quote from someone in the room here. So absolutely agree that, you know, if you want to be competitive, it makes sense, right? That you might want to go agile, right? But the problem is, there's two problems. One is that if you look at the average tenure of CEOs, if I can find it, if you look at the average tenure of S&P 500 CEOs, the tenure of CEOs is getting shorter and shorter. So the fact that I've run $1 billion company in 3 years it goes away, that's fine, but that's $36 million later. So I actually don't care, right? So, because they're not necessarily tied to long-term outcomes of the organisation, right? That's the first thing. The second one is that when we look at organisations and stats, and I'll quote my colleague here very poorly, right? If you do Agile, it certainly makes sense. And one of the stats that I had, actually I might ask you to jump in with the stat on 25%. That's right. Do you have a microphone? Sorry, Mark. So if you adopt Agile, I'll let you explain the stat that we spoke about last night over drinks.
So we did some internal research across the 200 software companies in our group, and we found that the top 25% of SaaS products that we make and sell, in terms of deployment frequency, basically the products that we deploy to production every day, those products grow 4 times faster. The revenue grows 4 times faster than the bottom 25%, which are the products that are, roughly speaking, deployed to production once a month. So being agile, you can really see the effect and impact on the bottom line.
Yep, thank you. So that's a fantastic stat. Don't get many stats like that, which is why I was going to put it in, but I sort of ran out of time last night. So it supports your assertion that if you go Agile, you get those types of returns and it goes 4 times faster, you should go Agile. The answer is yes. But again, I've got 12.4 million, or 36 if it's over 3 years, million reasons not to do anything, given I'm the king of the jungle today. And if I embark on a transformation, it's of greater risk and I'm more likely to lose my job if it fails. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So we are already a little bit over time, but I think we're still going to do 2 or 3 more questions, and then we can continue the discussion over lunch.
First off, thanks. A really quick presentation. So I want to emphasize 1 or 2 things and then have one question for you. first off, like 2 of the 4 questions now were about models and processes. And I think what you wanted to say to us is it's not about models and processes. It's all about people and it's all about culture. And honestly, at least in my companies and most companies I see, people don't get that concept. So if you, for example, watch the Spotify videos, probably only watch the second one, because that's about the culture. The first one about the model, really, it doesn't matter. And the other thing is, when you look at it, and you had it on the bottom right on one of the slides, it's about culture in general, and the people. Did you ever had a situation at one point where you were not able to change the people, because people usually don't change or are hesitant to change, and it was hard to change the culture, and because we know that culture is based on, most of the time, on the CEO or on the founder of the company, were there ever a situation you said we have to change the people, so get rid of CEOs or other people in higher positions? Because that's sometimes probably, I know it's not practical, but did you ever recommend that?
Yes. I've had a situation where I flew into the country, and when I met the CEO, he told me that, he said, I resign today. I said, why? He goes, because I knew you were going to come and I knew there were going to be problems, so I'm going to retire. Right? Because he knew he'd done some things that were inappropriate. That's probably the best thing to say. The business was at risk because of his actions. However, in most cases, right, I actually think that's a rare circumstance. The vast majority of organisations and people that I know turn up to work because they want to do a good job, right? They want to have happy people. They want to have happy customers. No one likes turning up and getting the customer going, you moron, or what? Oh, sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to say that. In Europe, they say nasty things to you when you turn up to them. No one wants that. Everyone actually wants to turn up, to have a happy customer. Hey, you guys are fantastic. They're doing a great job. That's what people want, right? So one of the arguments I always have that I sort of, commonly close with is that at the end of the day, the speed of your agile transformation is not limited by the speed at which I can teach, but it's almost always limited at the speed of learning within your organisation, right? And the common observation I make is that our job is in the agile world in particular is to help educate other people that there are better ways of doing work that get them better outcomes more predictably with happier people, right? So the challenge that I always have though is when you're put into an organisation to help, you're essentially teaching them stuff that's 30 years old, right? So that tells you the learning gap that we have in our organisations that we need to bridge and to help with. Does that sort of make sense? So yes, I've recommended the termination of people, or they've resigned out of choice when I turn up. Apparently reputation precedes me sometimes. In other cases, it's simply a case of a misunderstanding or not knowing that there's a better way. And the moment you show them there's a better way, they just go and it takes off. That's our job.
Yeah, Peter, when you go to an organization, how do you motivate the CEOs to change? Do you have $12 million?
With 12.4 million US reasons to not change, in most cases, people don't want to change or doing, and I go back to my earlier point, everyone is doing the best job they know how, right? If you can show them there's a better way of getting their outcome they're looking for without dramatically changing things, you can get that first shift and the first step in the journey, right? And it's much like, and I actually use weight loss as an example. It's about helping them go the first walk, and then after that, the first fast walk, the first jog, the first run, and then before you know it, they're chasing marathons, right? Our job is to help them be better at what they do by introducing new ways of working, new techniques. Just one technique here, one technique there. If they get a good result, then they'll do another one, and they'll do another one, and they'll do another one, and then you start to build that flywheel of change, right? And that's how we typically find it working.
Thank you.
Cool. So we have one last question from Slack. Bernd Schönwelder asks, or is was missing a little bit the word courage in your presentation, and is wondering if you can maybe say a little bit more about that, and because
About what, sorry?
courage,
Courage.
yeah.
You need some, right? I touched upon this with the Agile folks within your firm earlier, is that, you know, sometimes when you're working in an organisation, help them shift the way they're working, right? By definition, your value set is not aligned to the organisation you're in. Because if it was aligned, you wouldn't be able to push them further, right? The second thing is, every meeting and every conversation you go, you have to remember, what is the last conversation I had? What is the roles and responsibilities they have? How can I push them one step further in the right direction? Like a personal trainer, right? How do I push them, right? So does it take courage? Yeah, it does. It does take courage to stand up and be the only person in the room trying to push them in a particular direction and always making everyone uncomfortable, right? And it's that judgment about how hard do I push, right, before I get smacked, right? An example I'll give you is I'm working on I'm just finishing up a large transformation. We've taken 1,700 people to adopt agile ways of working, right? I'm the 6th enterprise coach in the role, right? Everyone has lasted less than somewhere between 3 to 6 months. I've lasted just over 2 years, right? And now I'm saying, time. The value non-alignment is getting to me now. Time for a change. And you know, when I was invited here, I thought, yes, I'll take a bit of a break before I finish, you know, and come up to this wonderful city, and then I'll go back and close out the rest of the engagement, right? So does it take courage? Yeah, every day you've got to turn up and be the odd one out. And that's the problem that you have to do every day as an agent. Does that make sense? Cool.
Thank you very much, Peter.